Was Duolingo the first thing you reached for when you decided to learn Portuguese? Well, if you're moving to Portugal, then I've got news for you. And I'm shocked by how many people still don't know this. Duolingo is far more useful if you're moving to Brazil. That's right, the famous green owl only offers Brazilian Portuguese, which is quite different and not the best path to go down if you want to understand Portuguese as it's spoken in Portugal. So if you want to be on the true path to success when it comes to getting conversational in European Portuguese, you need to settle in and join me for this video in which I will explain why Duolingo won't help you in Portugal and what you need to do instead. So first things first, seja bem-vindo if you are new to this channel. My name is Liz and I have studied Portuguese academically for over a decade, and I've lived in both Brazil and in Portugal. I now help people who are relocating or retiring to Portugal to get confident and conversational in European Portuguese. I have over 1,000 students in my online Portuguese Pro program, so I live and breathe this stuff. My free taster lesson for the program is down in the description if you want to find out more. So in this video, I'm going to cover two things. Number one, why learning Brazilian Portuguese isn't the best idea when you are moving to Portugal. And number two, why gamified apps like Duolingo are not, in my personal opinion, the best way to learn a language. So first up, why don't I recommend learning Brazilian Portuguese when it is the same language? Isn't it the same as like American and British English? Well, actually, no. Again, speaking as someone who has studied and used both variants of the language, we have a lot more difference in number one, the pronunciation, number two, the vocabulary, and three, the grammar. I've actually done in-depth videos on all of these differences, which I will link in the description, but let me break down the most important part. If you've learned to say good morning as bom dia from Duolingo, it really isn't that far off from bom dia, which is how it's said in Portugal. Your downfall won't be in being understood in Portugal. We have tons of Brazilians here and it is no problem to understand them, but it's you that is going to have the difficulty if you've only been listening to Brazilian Portuguese and you get to Portugal and you're going to have a lot of trouble understanding what people are saying. And we all know that that is the worst feeling. This is down to a couple of things. The Brazilians use a lot more open vowels in their Portuguese. So for example, the word tarde in Brazil, you can really hear that E, that end syllable. But in Portuguese, from Portugal, we will close down that E, tarde. It's happening in here and it's much more difficult to hear. The Brazilians will also enunciate their syllables a lot more clearly. So what do I mean by that? Well, we actually have two types of languages, stress-timed and syllable-timed. And in a syllable-timed language like Spanish or Italian, we're actually going to stress all of the syllables equally, okay? Now, Portuguese, on the other hand, is a stress-timed language, and so fewer of the syllables are going to be stressed. So, what we need to do is think of this as like a spectrum. It's not the case that Brazilian is syllable-timed. Actually, it's still a stress time language because it is still Portuguese. But if we think of it as a spectrum, then the Brazilian Portuguese is leaning closer to being a syllable time language simply because they are better at enunciating all the syllables. But in Portugal, as you may know if you have listened to people speak here, they drop off a lot of syllables and you can't hear them. And this is where it's going to be tricky for you to understand what's going on. People also comment that Brazilian Portuguese is a little slower and more musical, making it easier to follow. So, for example, when greeting a friend, a Brazilian might say, "E aí, cara, tudo bem?" As you can see, we heard all of the syllables there. But a Portuguese person might say, "Então, como é que tu estás?" And you can see from the words written on the screen that half of those syllables were dropped off. This is where the problem lies. This is also something I go into a lot more detail in this video on understanding spoken Portuguese. I'll link it in the description. So if you listen to Portuguese audio from the start, you'll be doing your ears a favor because they are going to start to tune into these closed vowels and dropped syllables because you're learning how to look out for them. So the next piece of the puzzle then, why don't I think gamified apps work for learning a language? Well, I can't tell you how many people we we talk to who say, I've got a 120-day streak on Duolingo, but I still can't really string a sentence together. This is because these apps give you a false sense of progress, because they're more focused on relatively random vocabulary versus practical everyday language. I mean, when are you going to need to say that the dog is wearing a skirt? It's also too reliant on multiple choice games and tests rather than actually speaking, and that's what you should be training if you want to learn to speak Portuguese. So what do I recommend you do instead? Well, the number one thing is to master pronunciation to allow you to be understood perfectly. Again, I have a free pronunciation guide linked below that will really help you here. Then you need to make sure that you start speaking in everyday interactions from day one. I have a whole playlist here on YouTube of practical situations that you can practice, as well as this 30-day challenge video where I take you through 30 practical phrases that you will need when you first arrive. These are great places to start. I also recommend you use a bite-sized, step-by-step approach with grammar. It really shouldn't overwhelm you and have you feeling stuck. It should be only part of what you are focusing on in your learning. I cover all these things and more in my free taster lesson for beginners. I promise it will be so much more productive than spending an hour on Duolingo. You'll walk away with the ultimate quick start guide to getting conversational, so I hope to see you there. Regardless of which course or program you choose to follow to learn Portuguese, I always say that apps should be the side dish, not the main meal. So some of the side dishes that I actually recommend to my students to supplement their learning are Lingui, Memrise, Drops, and Portuguese verb conjugator, as well as Lingo Clip, which helps you learn with music. I can't forget about that one. So for a detailed breakdown of these apps, I do recommend you can watch this video next, and I'll be back next week with more tips and tutorials to improve your confidence and conversation skills in Portuguese. Hope to see you there. Ciao for now.